Welcome to the latest episode of Lateral Think, brought to you by Melbourne Athletic Development. Melbourne Athletic Development is a sports and injury management clinic based in Melbourne, Australia. To maximise your performance, optimise your injury management, contact the team at Melbourne Athletic Development. As many of you know, Jack and I have a very diverse understanding across multiple areas of practice, whether they relate to sports performance, say for instance with my background in track coaching, or with Jack and his background in yoga practice. We've combined a lot of this knowledge over time with our clinical and sports performance experiences to really develop what we do. And as you know, we love education. So what we've tried to do is take that knowledge and put it into an online learning community. We think this is important because it's an opportunity for people to interact, learn, and upskill as they try to improve the practice of what they do. So if this is something that you would be interested in doing, head to melbourneathleticdevelopment.com.au/education and get an understanding of how you can upskill your current practice.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we have Dr. Alessandro Garofolini on with us. Thank you for joining us today, Alessandro.
Thank you for having me. Sorry, it's good to be here with you.
To begin with, do you mind introducing yourself? Just give us a background of who you are, what you do, and your current position.
Yeah, who am I? I don't know. I'm a husband of one wife. I'm a father of two, and I like simple things that I can understand, and I love doing research because of those serendipity moments when you put together all the different points and you got a clear picture of something that you've been pondering for a while on too. So, as for what I do. I'm a physio by trade, so I've been practicing for a few years back in Italy. Then I moved to Melbourne, and I did a bachelor degree in exercise science, a master degree in clinical gait analysis, and then I got my PhD in 2019 in biomechanics and motor control. Currently, I'm employed as a postdoc at Victoria University, and we're working with the Department of Defense, looking at wearable technologies such as exoskeletons to see how they can improve life in a way, so reduce injuries and improve performance of people working, mainly manual handling tasks, which could be very relevant not just for soldiers but also for general population. That's pretty much what am I.
You mentioned doing your PhD on biomechanics and motor control, and one of the key topics we want to discuss today is one of your publication in 2019 of looking at fascial organisation and motor synergies. I think a good place to start, though, is we hear this term motor control all the time, and it's often used in a very vague and arbitrary sense.
Yeah.
When you think about motor control, how do you define it, and what kind of working definition do you use for your research?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. I mean, it could mean anything to different people, really, and you can find different definitions of motor control, and probably it just depends on which school of thoughts you follow, and what works for you and for the work that you do. So to me, motor control is the ability of the body to allow you to do a lot of things while you are moving. So basically, to me, the body is controlling itself to some extent, so that your mind can wander about other stuff. So, once again, I'm not sure I'm giving a definition truly, but yeah, motor control is the ability to coordinate multiple or abundant, as somebody says, degrees of freedom of your body, so that you can enjoy life at the most.
It's actually interesting, like the way you put it, of it's something that's happening subconsciously to actually free your mind up to be able to do other tasks, whether that's obviously observing your environment or even thinking of like intellectual tasks that you're doing when you're sort of walking and pondering, or perhaps sitting in front of a computer doing a podcast.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think we often get stuck on this idea of it's this conscious process where we always need to use these perhaps like internal cues to give information to our body about what muscles should be recruited or which muscles shouldn't be.
Mm-mm. Yeah, you are right. There is that thinking around. I'll tell you what. Like, it is clear to me that it cannot be possible. That you have to consciously organize movement as you do it. And a simple thing that you can try is if you move your hand A to B without thinking it, and you will do it very smoothly. If I'll ask you to do it, but now try to feel and adjust the muscles, each muscle that is moving and contracting to actually bring your hand from A to B, then you start shaking. So there is this thought that I got, and I use this often to actually give an example. So there is a caterpillar, right? The caterpillar has a lot of legs, and so and he moves the legs and he can walk without problem. Now one day he was asked, how do you coordinate all of these different legs so that you can move so smoothly? And the caterpillar said, I never thought about it. And when he started thinking it, he couldn't walk anymore. You know what I mean? I think the body is the same thing. It does its own thing, and really, there is no way that we can consciously control it unless we want to. But once you do it, the movement, it becomes nothing like you want it.
Yeah, and I even think of too, like if you think about, say, different types of cueing, where if you're focusing too much internally, which there may be a role for doing, it actually causes a reduction in movement efficiency and a reduction in force output.
Correct.
And I think that in itself highlights the fact that trying to override these systems that happen at a subconscious level leads to ineffective movement over time, if you're doing it consistently at least.
And it has a lot of implication when you think about learning and training, because what is the best way of doing it is focusing people on those cues so that they can learn just how to contract and how to move one movement at a time, or you try to focus them on something external to the body. So like focusing on the ball, for instance, or the racket, or something that really it requires you to move, but now your mind is just focusing on something else, and the body is learning how to adjust to what you want rather than learn how to actually do the movement, if that makes sense.
Do you think that there is ever a point where internal cueing actually works better? Have you seen that happen? And do you think that there are instances in which that is the case? Because the body of literature seems, particularly in relation to novice performers, to favor external cueing. But actually, like you might not know my background, but as a track coach with experienced athletes, that's not always the case. Sometimes you try and set up external cued exercises, and at some point you just go, oh, fuck it, like I need you to do exactly this, and it works. So I'm always in two minds about this, because all the research says don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. As Jack says, it reduces this. But I actually have found on certain instances, if they understand their own anatomy well enough and they're actually a very skilled performer, you can actually say to them, I need you to do exactly this, and they do it. And then you can amplify that behavior by creating some sort of external cue that reinforces that movement.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the idea that we have to have is that the body is a whole system, right? And yes, you can change or train specific movements or segments, let's say doing some specific movements at some point to change that one through repetition, pretty much. So let's say, as you say, running, and you say you just need to land on your toes, for instance, right? So you definitely need to change it, and you force them to change that part. The thing that you have to understand is like, okay, that one will have an effect on all the other joints, right? So as a whole, the body now has a different external task. It's not the same as before. So you are right. Sometimes you need to ask them to change specific, let's say, part or specific joint movements in this case to get a better results as overall. and by forcing it, by repeating that, all the rest of the body is adjusting to it. So yes, I agree with you. You should sometimes just focus on internal cues and change specific parameters if you want to get a better overall results. But keep in mind that all the body is changing to adjust to it. So it's not just because you change that one, that's the change that made the results. Is actually that is the change that changed the overall function of the body. So as long as you got that in mind, I think it's easier to understand that you can change individual things to get the overall system to react differently.
You made me think, yesterday we actually did a presentation to a clinical group, and the questions got asked around, biomechanics and the effect of, say, physical capacities, someone's strength or power profile, what they actually can produce at a localized level. And we started to explain to them some of these concepts, or Jack did at least. And he actually brought up your paper on some of these things to give them an understanding of some of the aspects that we discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying makes me think about an idea that I've gone back and forth with the biomechanists that I work with around the expression of particular movement patterns as a reflection of someone's biomotor abilities more so than as a motor task itself. So for instance, as I said, I work in track and field. If someone actually has an extreme level of, say, power production, they've developed maybe outside of the running, field, they've done it in the gym, often they actually can express movement in running that doesn't come from necessarily coaching. They actually just coordinate it because they have such a level of, physical output. And I wanted to get your idea on how much or what the interaction you think is between someone having, say, physical biomotor tools and what they can express from a motor, a motor learning perspective. Because often I have this discussion with people where they say, well, we need to teach them the skills to be able to move. Like, let's design an exercise that gets them to do it. And I often say to them, they actually just don't have the physical capability to do that task. Even if you design the best exercise, externally cued, whatever it is, they actually just don't have the biomotor ability to carry that off. So part of what your job is to actually go away and give them that biomotor ability to even try and do that in the first place.
Yeah, and you are right. So I believe, and that's my personal belief, that it has a lot to do with the fascial system. So, I've been playing volleyball for a few years when I was younger, I can say that. And some of my teammates were uncoordinated. And we have been playing volleyball together for ages. So we have been through the same training, let's say, for years. But still, there was no way, no improvement at all. They were uncoordinated, and that's it, full stop. You know what I mean? Which I think is what is pretty much what you were saying. So somebody is just naturally gifted to be like a sporty kind of guy, and somebody is actually not, and it doesn't really matter, how much training, how much functional stuff you do, is not going to happen. And to me, there is a biological reason. I mean, if you talk with somebody that does genetics, he will tell you, it's genetics, that's the issue. But even if you think about it, it's the expression of a gene, but really has to be something bigger, because it's not just proteins. It needs to be something more tangible, and to me is the fascial system. So either the function of the fascia in different layers, and maybe we will go through after, but just to put it there, or it's just the composition of the fascia, that it may be genetically determined, and therefore it doesn't really matter. It cannot get, let's say, adaptable and elastic as you would expect. And therefore, even if you train a lot, there is no way to change that. And it doesn't really matter even the muscle gets stronger and you can produce a lot of power output. If you are not able to change the fascial organization, as I said, your function will not change. So
all right, let's get into that, because I think that one of the things, obviously, as you would be very aware, in places like Australia, discussion about fascia and understanding the anatomical ramifications of what fascia does and how it operates and the physiology of it is not well understood, right?
I
So
agree.
you say that, and there would be people who are scratching their head saying, Alessandro, what are you talking about? So what are the clues in your experience, in your research, in what you're seeing and the people you're collaborating with that makes you think that part of the reason that some people are uncoordinated is the underdevelopment of certain fascial either characteristics or anatomy? What are the clues that you're seeing that make you start thinking, okay, there's a clear hypothesis for why this could potentially be the case?
And I was just going to add to that, just thinking about how we actually are particularly related to some of your work, like what is fascial organization too?
Yeah.
And then like how does that relate to motor synergies? So there's
Yeah.
about 5 or 6 questions for you to answer.
Good luck with that,
It's-
Alessandro.
Just remind me that I forget some.
Yeah, sure.
Now, well, yeah, it's funny that yesterday I was googling fascial organization just to see what comes up, and it seems like I was the first one in using that terminology. It's just the first my paper, it comes as the first result in Google,
That's
which
good.
is, well, yeah. I mean, I didn't know,
nice.
but yeah, yeah, it's funny. But to me, it's relatively simple. I use that term just to describe how anatomically and functionally the connective tissue that is surrounding muscle fibers and a bundle of muscle fibers and muscles belly as a whole, they do connect together and they kind of talk to each other, and they create these links or bridges, if you want, that transport or transmit the forces. So that system is not there by chance, obviously, and the connective tissue is always seen as just an envelope, something that is just there to make things gliding around, and that's it. But what I've seen, and through others' work more than mine, to be honest, although it's a field that I'm exploring, is how these forces could also be measured. So there is a real transmission of force through the fascial system, which has a lot of implications for motor control. So because it means that a muscle is linked to other muscles, not just by neurological inputs, but also by physical links, which makes sense to then look at the muscles as a unit that it does nothing more than contracting. So the power of the connective tissue is to coordinate that contraction so that it means something. So to me, that is the evidence that fascia has a central role in motor action and synergy. So synergies, just to get that definition out as well, or motor synergies, is nothing more than the coordination of multiple elements that they work together to achieve a task goal. And unlike an example that I saw from Professor Mark Latache, probably you definitely know him by name at least, is a very simple example. So if you have two force sensors, right, and you are pressing on these two force sensors with two fingers, and the task is just to get the sum of that force stable. Let's say that you have to generate 10 units of force, let's say 10 newtons, just for instance. So you could say that you can produce 10 by producing 5 and 5 with the two fingers, right? But you could also have any other combination that make 10, like 9 and 1, 8 and 2, and all of them. So really, all these solutions are good because the task goal is to make 10. Now, how do you solve that? Because any solution is good that is making 10, but now the contribution of the two fingers, it could be, to some point, it could be infinite if you extend the example to multiple muscles working around a joint. It could be, how much force each muscle needs to contribute to make that joint move to that extent, or to make that torque happen, which is the force. So synergy is the neurological, if you look at how Latache explains, is the neurological organization of all these somebody says redundant, Latash says abundant degrees of freedom, so multiple elements that are working together with the specific and unique task goal. Now, the fascial system, on the other hand, is the other face of the same coin, because, and once again, that's probably I should always say it's my opinion, just not get in trouble, but there cannot exist a neurological construct like this without an anatomical substrate that actually allow this to happen. Because, neurons are, by definition, non-linear. It means you can change until it's under threshold, is doing nothing, a neuron. When it gets over a certain threshold, it just gets all of it. It's like nothing on all. There is no modulation for a neuron to be active. It's either active or it's not active. And the same thing is for the muscle. It's either active or it's not active. So how do you modulate that? It cannot be only neurologically. It has to have an anatomical substrate, which is represented by the fascia, so that you can change the length of these muscles without the need to have a neurological input. That is what we were trying to explain in the paper. So the parallel between these neurological control synergies and the substrate that actually needs to be there so that this can happen. And you have to remember that any sensors in the body, so free-ending sensors or muscle spindles or any sensor that you can think of that gives feedback to the central nervous system is embedded into the fascia. So really, if you think about it, there is nothing in the muscles that gives any feedback. So all the feedback about the state of the muscles in reality is the state of the fascia around the muscles that gives the feedback. And by knowing that, you know what the state of the muscle. So it's the balance between the container and the content. But really what it gives information to the central nervous system is the container. The content being the muscle, the container being the fascia. So that is how it simplifies everything. But that's the importance of the fascia. All the neurological inputs are passing through the fascia and they are mediated by the fascia. So the state of the fascia is very important to get feedback back, to get input out to the muscles, and also to regulate the state of the muscles when the muscle is not active. So yeah, that's what we. Probably I missed a couple of questions actually. Now I'm thinking.
No, that's a good starting point. So, tell me if I'm wrong in this, but I think about some of the models we have for motor control at the moment are purely neuromuscular, of this neural signal being sent to the muscle contracting. But as we integrate some of the understanding of the fascial system into sensory motor control, we're getting initially maybe a neurological input from the brain to the muscle, but then you're getting this almost feed forward and feedback mechanism as the fascia is tensioned from some of the myofascial expansions from the muscle to the fascia that sends signals back to the spinal cord that then further regulate what motor units are recruited. Because if there's more tension here, or I think particularly too, when you think about more complex movements, and let's stick with something like running, as you go to, say, for instance, drive the hip up, you're creating tension through, say, that anterior fascial chain, so through like the anterior part of fascia lata, that is transmitted, say, into the anterior crural fascia, that essentially provides a pre-activation of that anterior compartment, to think of the ankle being dorsiflex as it comes to drive down. Is that a fair assessment of thinking about how we think about the fascial system and its involvement in motor control?
It is. You are completely right. So the idea is this one. So when myofascial unit, as they will call it, but let's say when a segment is moving, is the fascia is going to transmit the forces, or partial part of the forces, to the segments that are connected to it within a sequence, as you said, like the flexion extension part. So let's say all the as you're running it, so hip flexing and the knee extending. So all of this is just to pre-activate what is going to be working after. And you need that to obviously avoid injuries as the first one, but also to get ready. That's the thing. So to get the level of activation of those muscles almost there, so that they are ready. So if you think about the muscles, even when you are at rest, is always at very close to the threshold to be active. So that is how we are as human beings. So we are ready for action at almost every time. So so the idea is the fascia is pre-activating those muscles further in the chain, not necessarily just pre-activating as they are active but not much. So they are is changing the length, the resting length of those muscles to get the neurological control very close to the threshold to be active. So that's the thing. So to me, there are two ways of controlling if a muscle is active or not. One is, as you said, the input that is sent, so for voluntary actions from the central nervous system. But the other one, and I think that's the role of the gamma system, let's say, so through the spindles, is to change the level of activation, but subthreshold activation of the alpha of those muscles further in the chain. So that, they still are subthreshold, which means they're not active. But by changing either the threshold, so you lower the threshold, or by changing the level of activation, still subthresholds, it means that they are getting ready.
Yeah, so it's essentially like priming the body, because, like you said, that transfer of force can create enough tension to basically get the muscle spindles firing. And
Correct.
I won't get too much into the weeds of muscle physiology, but essentially, getting that gamma afference feedback to get the alpha motor neuron ready to contract.
Correct, exactly. So, yeah, without going too much into physiology, but if just to give some references. So, if you look at the work of Anatole Feldman, for instance, when he talks about this equilibrium point and how the movement, which is a theory of motor control anyway, so how the movement is achieved by controlling parameters. And the only parameters that the central nervous system is controlling, or let's say the primary one, is the muscle length, in his view. So by changing that parameter, movement just emerges. So there is nothing else that the central nervous system is controlling. And in a way, I think it's true, and it speaks a lot in terms of, if you record EMG signals from the muscles, it's very hard to control it. Even if you ask somebody to control a variable, so something that is emerging, as you said before, the neurons or muscles are non-linear by nature. So either they're not active or active. There is nothing in the middle. So it's very hard to modulate something like that. Or even worse, to model something like that. Although they try, and they do, but there are assumptions in those models every single time, because otherwise you can't do it. It's a very simplified version of what the human body is. So that's one point. The other one is that we forgot to say, which is very critical for the fascia, is that muscles do not go from one bone to the other. If you see any modeling of the human body, you will always see muscles as a line that are connecting two bones, at least two bones, with a joint in the middle. But by acknowledging that some of the muscles, at least part of that insertion, goes onto the fascia of other muscles, then you have to wonder why. And that is where coordination comes about, isn't it? For what we said before. How can you transmit it? So you contract the muscles, and then the next one will contract. If you think about the normal, let's say, anatomy, it's hard to understand how. But if you introduce the fascial system, and you think that some muscles are actually contracting and pulling on the fascia of another muscle, then it's easier to understand how forces can be transmitted from one segment to the other.
This brings me back then to where we started this discussion, when John was discussing that relationship between someone's biomotor abilities, when you think about things like flexibility, strength, and then even what you were mentioning before about some of your teammates who you played volleyball with who lacked that coordination. Do you think that relationship between, say, developing biomotor abilities of, say, getting stronger in the gym, part of that is actually about developing the fascial network that helps to provide better sensory feedback to coordinate movement? Do you think that's a plausible theory to that relationship, and why it actually can be useful to go, well, where is there a lack of development in this person's body? Is that influencing their coordination because of that lack of active stiffness through that myofascial chain?
Absolutely, and you will probably know better than me. But when you put somebody under a training at the gym, the first few weeks you don't see any, let's say, physiological change in the muscle, isn't it? But you do see a change in function, like they become stronger, but they don't become big or bigger.
Mm.
Let's say. So what is happening there? I don't think it's just a change in the neurological drive for the muscles, but also a changing in the fascia. It could be either the anatomical characteristics, so it becomes some direction becomes more let's say flexible, or let's say more open, if you wanna. But the fascia is learning that kind of movement at that kind of load that is passing through that direction. And by doing that, it's like let's say you have a pen and you draw it on a piece of paper, right? And if you keep drawing up and down on the same line, you create just this groove,
Mm.
okay? And then it's way easier to stay on that line if you have done it many times, because now there's this groove and the pen stays inside it. So to
Mm.
me, that is what is happening with the fascia. The more you you train, the more you facilitate solutions that are through that line. And some people will actually be very, let's say, they can do it very easily, and therefore they become very flexible, and so they can, as they become stronger, they also become good at the movement. And some people, due to how the fascia is made, or is not able to change, they can't do it. Every time you draw a line is in a different direction. You're not creating that groove anymore. So you're still, building up the muscles, but you are not defining, uh, let's say, that set of solutions that becomes easier to get or easier to use. That is how you become, skillful, I would say. Yeah.
Well,
Does it make sense?
yeah, yeah. Oh, I think that's a good segue into trying to get your understanding and idea of how you then attack trying to make change in someone's, motor function. If you're taking this lens that you need to be affecting the fascial organization, one, is that possible? To what degree is it possible? And the third thing is really, how would you address that given what you understand about fascial organization?
Yeah, I think what we are missing is the ability to measure those things. I mean, we can talk
Yeah.
about it, you can see it, but I don't think there is any functional test, or any test in general, that shows you how much the fascia system has changed or is changing. So it's
Mm.
very hard to prove it in a way. So it is
Do you think
that's
that that's a reflection though of someone's coordination change? Do you think that, like, if excuse me, if you see that the definition of their motor output is heavily influenced by their fascial organization, do you think that if you see an improvement in their coordinative capability, that you actually are seeing that underlying change, even though it's difficult to actually measure what that organization looks like?
Yeah, to me, there is no way that you can change your abilities in terms of coordination and fluidity of the movements, or specific movements or sport movements, unless you change the function or the anatomy of the fascia. Yes,
Mm.
unfortunately, as I said, I don't think there is any functional test that can prove it yet. So I'm
But
hoping
that's your job, mate.
exactly.
Well, it's something I think about too, and I'm not a researcher, but it seems that a lot of the research around motor control now is based around EMG analysis. And it kind of gives you, obviously, again, that indication perhaps of the neurological input, but it's really missing that component of the fascial input and how it works as a sensory organ. So have you got any ideas? Like how can we actually further extend this area of research? Because I'm just thinking about the importance of being able to somehow quantify it for it to be more adopted in terms of clinical practice.
Well, I believe something is moving. There are a lot of groups now that are looking at the fascia and the effect of changes in the fascia, which once again it will just increase the possibility that somebody will come up with a good method to measure it. I'm thinking a study was later last year published by University of Queensland where they look at the change in the fascia after intervertebral damage.
This is Paul Hodges' work, yeah.
It is, so you're familiar with that one. Okay, perfect.
Yeah, indeed.
So yeah, what they're seeing that the change in the fascia that is embedding the muscle spindles, it does change the output from the spindles, meaning that the feedback that is coming from the muscles, which is supposed to be from the muscle spindles, is changing based on the change in the structure or the anatomy of the fascia. And so it has implication on your perception of pain after some low back disorders, let's say. But that to me is already a proof that if you change the fascia to some extent, it will have an influence on the neurological part. And that neurological part could be just the feedback as they've done it, but it could also be just the input to the muscles as well. So basically it's just another way to say the fascia is controlling muscle action and therefore the coordination. That's how I read it through the lines.
I'm thinking about a clinical population group in terms of relation to this topic, and that's with people who have hypermobility. Because, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this too, John, but I think about people who've got hypermobility. When you're trying to do some type of rehabilitation, the thing that I find more effective is getting them to do more high velocity movements. And my rationale for that, thinking about this area of research, is when you're doing high velocity movements that are more complex in nature, so whole body, you're creating more tension that then allows them to have better coordination. Because I find often when you're doing a slower movement, even if it's doing something like a back squat, they often don't have that ability to understand how to move their body. And I'm wondering whether that's due to a lack of tension within their fascial network that changes when you start to add more speed or complexity to the movement.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the stiffness of the fascia is what makes, the resistance through, complex movements. So I think you're doing the right thing, if you want my opinion. There is indeed a difference, even if you look at the between the sex. Like, women will tend to be more flexible than men. And once again, I think I haven't seen any study, but I think it will be easy to show that in general the fascia is less dense in women than men. So we are stiffer by nature, let's say, and that has to do with the composition of the fascia. So how much water is retaining, well, without going into details, but how much collagen is there. So yeah, you are right. So if you wanna create stability, sometimes increasing velocity will increase the stiffness or the resistance, let's say, that the fascial system will provide. So it's a very good point. Yeah.
Is that something you've seen, John, in terms of thinking about different sort of perhaps fascial profiles and thinking about their ability to their like level of coordination, or perhaps even the movement strategies that certain people who are more hypermobile create enough tension in their system?
I wouldn't say necessarily in hypermobile populations, but it reminds me a lot of, say, children, where children tend to be more compliant in general. And particularly in sport, you see that they often get very good and coordinated in the sport-specific movement, but then you take them out of that environment to something novel and they can't create that stability or movement pattern Exactly what you said, they tend to rush through things because they feel like they can actually coordinate it when it's moving quickly. And as you guys are both mentioning, it's sort of like they're hacking a way of creating some sort of tension through their myofascial system that they can't get unless they're moving at a much higher velocity. So yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily noticing it with hypermobiles, but I notice it with children. You know, and it's even why you see. I think this is what happens. Like, it reminds me a lot of what you see, what happens with people who specialize very early in sport, where, as Alessandro was saying, is like they've created that groove, so the movement pattern and particularly say the coordination of that fascial organization in that movement plane is really, really strong. And then you take them out of that environment, and they're a motor moron. They can't do anything. You throw a ball, it hits them in the face. Yet you ask them to do a very specific task. You know, whether it's say rowing or cycling, or, you know, in track and field, it's maybe a jump or a pole vault or something, and they're really, really good. And you're like, oh, this person's very coordinated. You take them off that apparatus and they're horrible. And it makes me think very much so of this, of like they've learned to be able to create. It's almost like a circus trick, you know. They can do that trick because they've greased that groove and they've created that one neural pathway, but also that fascial organizational understanding to carry that out over and over and over and over. You remove them from that, and they can't create tension in those other positions. They can't create the amount of coordinated movement that they need to do something that's novel. And that's the difference, I think, between someone who's truly coordinated, where they've got that overall system organization, both neurological but fascial as well. And, you know, the people who they can pick up any sport. You know, you say, oh, have you played this sport? And they say, oh, not really. Like, I played these other sports. And you say, well, you're very coordinated. I think that's what you see more than anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question, Alessandro, with regards to particularly things like chronic pain, because I think of a lot of the research, particularly like the late 90s, early 2000s, of looking at people who've got chronic neck pain, chronic low back pain. There's been a lot of EMG analysis of looking at changes in the electrical activity of action potentials in certain muscles. Like a classic example would be, say, like the transversus abdominis of the abdominal region, or the longus colli in the neck. What does this understanding of fascial organization and how that affects motor control, does that help to explain some of these changes? Like, do you think this sort of ties in with some of Paul Hodge's more recent work with looking at fascial changes and how that affects the behavior of a muscle?
Absolutely. I truly believe that the majority of problems that people will go to a physio for, they refer more to a fascial issue rather than a muscle one. So the muscle activity is just the reflection, as I said, of the container state, not the content, which is the muscle. It is not necessarily impact directly, but if the container is not able to adjust to the muscle contractions, then the muscle is forced to either activate more or less, right? It does depend always on the state of the container, not what is inside. So yeah, I would probably say that more than 90% of issues that they claim to be a muscle problem is actually resolvable if you consider the fascial system and how the fascial system changes due to injuries or chronic, disease, or anything actually, age, or there are a lot of, let's say, risk factors that will change the fascial composition or fascial function, that, as I said, they will just express through muscle activation changes, but really that's not where the issue is. So muscle stiffness, muscle weakness, muscle dysfunctions in general, they all can have a fascia, let's say, that could be linked to a fascial problem rather than a muscle itself problem. So yeah, what you mentioned, low back pain, cervical pain, all of these I think they are more related to fascial issues rather than muscles. So yeah, those studies are just reporting what you can see, but not really where the issue is.
Yeah, so really thinking as muscle contraction as an output, but then we need to think about what are the inputs that are influencing the behavior of the muscle.
Correct.
Have you got any ideas then about thinking about this in a clinical perspective? What kind of interventions can we use to think about how we develop fascial organization, or I think also too from someone who's had an injury or someone who's had long term pain, things that we can actually do to restore normal fascial mechanics. Have you got any ideas or opinions around that?
Well, I mean, if I go through what do you call it, the guidelines of the school that I'm assuming you are doing. uh, so yeah, fashion manipulation is it should
Well,
be at least considered.
it's interesting though, Alessandro. Like the one caveat that I put on that, Jack comes, he tells me all about it day in, day out. I hear about fascia a million times a
Yeah.
day, and and the one thing that I actually can't reconcile is I don't think that they do enough when it comes to the physical intervention associated with changing fascia.
Mm.
Right? They're very much associated with the manual therapy input. And it's not to say that that's not correct. I think that they're on the right track of proving that it is. However, I don't think that's the only way in which you can start changing fascial organization. In fact, I think it's probably it's going to be the least successful way to do so.
At least, and definitely long term too,
in terms of long-term
development of
change,
the whole
yes.
system. Yeah.
So, like as someone who comes even with the background of, you've got an exercise science degree, you understand that the physiological changes to tissue often come with mechanical stress. What interventions do you think potentially can influence it at that level? Because yes, you can touch the tissue and you can influence its behavior, but maybe that's not going to be a long-term change.
I think particularly too for people working in with athletic population groups
But well, even I think,
and,
as you said, with
general
like chronic
population.
pain,
Oh, totally.
people who actually clearly have a dysfunction in their fascial organization, and they need to make lasting change to it.
Yeah, and I think that's also like I think of Paul Hodge's work where it seems that in those animal models where they create a disc lesion, the one thing that prevents the development of fibrosis is exercise, like general physical activity. But then I'm also interested to think about, well, if we're starting to get into that pathological state, how do we try and change that through, it could be manual therapy, but I think also about exercise interventions.
You are totally right. I mean, exercise has been always the number one, protocol, if you want to, yeah, things that you do when you have a problem. So exercise in general is good because once again, you have to have an holistic way to look at the body. So exercise is good because it's activating a lot of different systems that at the end of the day are making things going better in your body, regardless. So changing posture is also another one that could be critical. You can do exercises, but it's very critical to most of the time open up those postures that because of pain you try to close or flex down. So by doing that change, you once again you align the body so that it can function better. So when you do exercise, you're actually stimulating those muscles through those lines of tensions that are um, let's say physiological for the body. So that's why I said manual therapy or myofascial therapy, it should be considered because you do need to put the body in the best state so the exercise will give you best results. So I agree, but unless you reduce those tensions on those points before you do exercise or in coordination with the exercise, you will always have half results. So, or let's say not the best result that you can get from the exercise that you prescribe. And that's why I said just go with the manual therapy first, probably.
Well, the other thing I think of too, when you think about creating tension through the fascial network, particularly through a chain, we want to try and do either more complex movements, so you're actually using the whole myofascial plane, or I think of doing more high velocity movements because you're going to add that lengthening, shortening. And I know there's some textbooks coming out now about, say, fascial training, And you do see things of people doing, say, high velocity movements with like a kettlebell swing and things like that.
Mm.
Does that make sense to you? Do you think about there's value in doing like a kettlebell swing through a large motion to create that almost stretch shortening cycle through the erector spinae, but swinging out in front of you? Or do you think that we don't even need to do that? We can even just do more simple loading patterns.
Well, I think the more you challenge the body, the better the results, especially in terms of coordination and function. There's always probably the threshold in terms of how much you do it. So all the fastest you go, or higher volume, or let's say higher weight you use, the higher chances that if something is not perfectly in line, it may get to injury. So I'm saying I think you have to challenge the body. Every time needs to, let's say, the control of the movement needs to be increasing as the weight or the velocity will increase. So it's more likely to get injured if you start to get power stuff even in a bad posture, let's say. So yes, you should do it, but just be careful about how the position of the body.
Yeah, don't compromise biomechanics
Yes,
in this situation.
correct.
Sure. Yeah. The other question I have for you is, you're trying to open up this field of motor control with looking at the fascial system's involvement. How has the response been to some of your work in terms of from other researchers? Have you find that there's an openness to think about how we need to include the fascial system in different models of sensory motor control? Or do you think there's still a fair way to go with really appreciating and implementing the fascial system into understanding human movement?
I think we are still behind. So to be able, so the challenge is this one: we need to prove what we are saying. So for a model to be implemented, or even for this idea to be implemented into a model, we'll need to prove our hypothesis with some evidence first. I don't think it will be implemented until we provide that evidence. But in saying that, I'm pretty sure we are not the only people or groups working on to this right now. So so I haven't had any let's say I haven't seen anybody try to develop further my hypothesis or our hypothesis yet. But it was important for us to put our ideas out so that it gave us, like this something to work toward. So okay, now I know that I want to prove it. Um, I think it's still early. I think there are different stages where the truth is, isn't it? So it could be completely neglected for some period of time, and then it becomes just rejected, and at some point it will become just common knowledge. So I believe my hypothesis is in the first stage where it's still neglected. Uh, so we'll see where we lead to. I I also acknowledge that it may need to be, just the details need to be fine-tuned with what could be the results of experiments. But I think it's still early to get the fascia into more computational models that are out there, which seems to dominate the motor control field.
Do you see it's something I've been interested with doing some of this fascial training in Italy, where I look at the Steco group, but it seems that in Europe in general, the adoption of some of the fascial research into clinical practice seems to be a bit more ahead than, say, here in Australia. And I've always wondered why that is. And I was actually interested, do you have any ideas or theories for why that is the case? I often wonder, is it related even to, say, cultural differences in terms of sort of the Australian sort of typical psyche and how we think versus other areas of the world?
Yeah, I'm not sure why, to be honest. I don't have any idea why it's not. I think maybe just the distance and the fact that being over there, and the school being there, and people outside the school being in Europe, they just, they show the presence in the field of physiotherapy and other medical practicing. So maybe it's just we will need a couple of schools here in Australia for the movement to grow and the understanding. Or maybe we just need to eat the learning system. So try to teach this stuff, create courses parallel to the traditional anatomy courses, where we actually introduce the fascial system. That's probably is why we are still behind. I don't think there are enough people that knows this here and willing to actually broad it out. So to make it more wider, let's say. So we are just few of us. So we need to stay together and grow, flourish.
Do you have any questions, John? We always end our podcast with our guests with asking a question about: is there anything that you're currently learning or interested in pursuing to learn that's either related to your professional work or even outside of it?
Well, I mean, yeah, definitely. I'm very interested in the effect of mental fatigue on the control of movement, and I'm developing few research plans to investigate that. And the other thing is re-injuries. So I'm always wonder why re-injuries seems to happen more often to certain segments or joints, and wondering if there is any link to change into the fascial system. And perhaps, that could explain why injuries are more often seen onto those muscle groups or around those joints. So those are the two main ones, so mental fatigue and re-injuries.
What's your interest in mental fatigue? What are you interested to explore there exactly?
Well, two things. One is how coordination of movement and control movement is affected by mental fatigue, let's say dual tasking, and not just reaction time, but really how the body is coordinating when under mental fatigue, and also learning while fatigue. That it seems obvious that you should be fresh and relaxed when you're learning something. That would be the best approach. I kind of like to challenge that idea, and there may be more value in fatiguing physically so that you can learn better. But it's just about the allocation of energies, and we'll see. I don't want to spoil too much, but that's the idea. So to me, when you overloading the brain, probably the body needs to be forced to find different solutions, and that will expand the solution that then you are viable, that probably you wouldn't explore without being mentally fatigued.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense too. It seems that a key thing that's important for mitigating injury or pain is the complexity or variability of movement. I mean, like, we're actually not necessarily designed to create the same neuromuscular patterns repeatedly, particularly for tasks that require repeated movement. And so, yeah, it's an interesting idea because, and the reality too is a lot of injuries, particularly in sport, happen in a fatigue state. So the importance of developing the ability to maintain appropriate neuromuscular strategies in that state seems reasonable.
Exactly. As you said, when you're fatigued, you may end up moving badly. So teaching how to move under mental fatigue would just probably, hopefully, provide more solutions that will avoid injuries. Yeah.
There's actually, when you're talking about fascial changes following injury, I did a podcast with a medical physician in the States, Jacques Corso, I believe is he pronounced his surname, and he's published a couple of papers, but a paper he published a few years back was looking at fascial hydrodissection for chronic hamstring injury and the application of a injection. I think he used a combination of corticosteroids with, I can't remember the other compound, to use ultrasound to identify an adhesion within the fascial layers that leads to a lack of gliding when you look at dynamic ultrasound, and using injections to address that and having some really valuable results with that. So I can actually send you his article if you're interested.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you very much for giving up some of your time to talk with us today. I look forward to seeing some of your future research.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll talk again in the future.
All right.
All
Take
right.
care.
Have a good day.